My daughter went missing during school lunch, and when I found her, I was even more heartbroken. My daughter Kaylee has been a ball of lovable sunshine since the day she was born, the kind of girl who had the bullies and the weaker kids jump roping together back in kindergarten. The only person who's never liked her has been my wife, Perry. She came into my life when Kaylee was 4. She's never been outright mean or hurtful. That would have been an instant dump. But she has been standoff-ish and made comments about how she wishes we could spend more time together when Kaylee and I went on our daddy-daughter dates. 2 weeks ago, my phone rang while I was working from home. It was Kaylee's school. "Sir, Kaylee didn't return from lunch. We've searched the building and we can't find her." My heart stopped. I grabbed my keys and ran out to my car. I called Perry, who was upstairs showering. "The school says Kaylee is missing. I'm driving down there right now. I can't wait for you. Get an Uber and meet me there as soon as possible." She sounded panicked and said she'd leave immediately. I started driving, and just my luck, I got stuck in lunch hour traffic. So much traffic that both my wife and I got to the school at the same time. I was sweaty and panicking when the principal met us at the front office. "Kaylee was in the cafeteria at noon." His voice was shaking. "She walked toward the bathroom, then never came back. That was an hour ago." Perry grabbed my hand as I dropped to my knees. We checked the security cameras. The footage was grainy, but just like the principal said, we saw Kaylee leaving the cafeteria alone and walking toward the back hallway. After that, the cameras didn't show where she went. She just disappeared. We called the police. They came within 20 minutes. An officer took down all of Kaylee's information: height, weight, what she was wearing. The first 48 hours are the most important. After that, your chances are low. Those words made my stomach drop. I started calling everyone. Kaylee's friends' parents, her teacher from last year. Nobody had seen her or knew anything. Perry was making a list of places we should check: parks, stores, the library downtown, anywhere Kaylee might go. We drove around the neighborhood for hours. We checked the playground 3 blocks away, walked up and down every street calling her name. The sun started setting. Perry kept saying, "We'll find her." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. Perry sat across from me, just as lost. Day 2. We printed 500 missing person flyers. Perry drove while I posted them on every pole and every store window. I spent the entire next day on missing children forums. Every time my phone buzzed, I thought it was news about Kaylee, but it was just people sharing the flyer. No real information. Day 4. The police suggested we call Kaylee's biological mother, who was imprisoned in another state. Perry made the call because I couldn't get the words out. I haven't heard from Kaylee, and honestly, I don't care that she's missing. Her bio mom hung up. I cried for the first time in front of Perry after that. She held me. We organized volunteers to search the woods near our house that night. Day 5. I stopped leaving Kaylee's bedroom, just sat on her bed holding her stuffed bear. A news station wanted to interview us. Perry and I sat on camera together and begged for anyone with information to come forward. Day 6. I couldn't function anymore. Couldn't eat. Just stared at the wall and listened to Perry talk about the potential of a closed casket funeral. Then Day 7 happened. An anonymous tip came in to the police. Someone mentioned passing by and seeing a girl matching Kaylee's description through a window. The address the person gave was Perry's sister Linda's address across town. When I told her, Perry looked as confused but also as hopeful as me. We drove there immediately. Linda opened the door and saw us. Her face went white. She tried to close the door, but I pushed through. I heard muffled crying from upstairs. I ran up the steps. Perry and Linda were right behind me, arguing incoherently. The crying was coming from behind a locked bedroom door. I started kicking it. Linda tried to grab me to stop, but Perry pried her away. I managed to blast it open. There I saw her. Kaylee was tied to the bed, gagged with a scarf, ropes around her wrists, her ankle zip-tied to the bedpost. She'd been there for the last 168 hours. I ran over to Kaylee and started untying the ropes. That's when Linda started screaming at Perry. "I told you this was insane!" She turned to me. "Perry made me do this. She forced me!" Perry instantly screamed back at her. "I didn't force you to do anything. You're a psychopath." Linda yelled louder. "You said if I didn't keep her here, you would tell everyone about—" "Shut up!" Perry cut her off. I couldn't move. Both sisters looked at me. "She's lying." They pointed at each other in unison. I pulled out my phone to call the cops. One of them went pale. The other just flashed a creepy smile. "Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments." I didn't care which one was lying. I turned back to Kaylee, and my hands went to the last rope around her left wrist. The knot was tight, and my fingers fumbled with it while both sisters kept screaming behind me. Perry yelled something about Linda being crazy. Linda screamed back about blackmail. I got the rope loose and pulled it off Kaylee's wrist. Her skin underneath was raw and red. I wanted to throw up. Both sisters were still going at it, and I spun around. "Both of you shut up right now." My voice came out louder than I meant it to. They both stopped talking and stared at me. I turned back to Kaylee. She was shaking so hard the whole bed moved. Her eyes kept moving around the room but didn't seem to focus on anything. I grabbed the blanket from the end of Linda's bed and wrapped it around Kaylee's shoulders. She felt so small and light when I picked her up. I carried her toward the door and both sisters started arguing again behind me. I didn't look back. I just walked down the stairs holding my daughter close to my chest. Her head rested against my shoulder and I could feel her shaking through the blanket. I pushed through the front door and sat down on Linda's porch steps. Kaylee stayed curled up against me with the blanket wrapped tight around her. I could hear Perry and Linda still yelling at each other somewhere inside the house. Their voices got louder, and then I heard something crash, probably a lamp or picture frame. I didn't care. I just held Kaylee and waited. She wasn't crying anymore, but she was still shaking. 4 minutes later, I heard sirens. 2 police cars pulled up to the curb, and 4 officers got out. I stayed sitting on the porch. One officer ran up to me and asked if I was the one who called. I nodded and pointed at the house. My daughter. She was tied up in there for 7 days. The 2 women inside are the ones who did it. The officer radioed something I couldn't hear, and then 2 officers went inside. I heard Perry's voice get even louder when they entered. The 3rd officer knelt down next to me and Kaylee. He asked her name and age, but she didn't answer, just kept her face pressed against my shirt. The officer stood up and radioed for paramedics. The 2 officers came back outside with Perry and Linda. They separated them and put Perry in the back of one police car and Linda in the other. Perry was crying and yelling at me through the window. I couldn't hear what she was saying. Didn't want to. Linda just sat there staring straight ahead with no expression on her face. The ambulance showed up 3 minutes later. 2 paramedics got out and walked over to where I was sitting with Kaylee. The female paramedic asked if she could check Kaylee over. I nodded and loosened my hold a little so they could see her. The male paramedic shined a light in Kaylee's eyes and she flinched away. He said something quiet to his partner. They checked her pulse and looked at her wrists and ankles. The female paramedic unwrapped the blanket a little to check the rest of her. She had bruises all around both wrists and her left ankle from the zip tie. The male paramedic said she looked badly dehydrated. He asked when she last had water. I said I didn't know. 7 days, maybe. The female paramedic told me they needed to take Kaylee to the hospital for a full check. I stood up still holding her and followed them to the ambulance. I climbed in the back and sat on the bench seat. A police officer told me they'd be questioning both women and would meet me at the hospital later. The ambulance doors closed and we started moving. The female paramedic sat across from me and started setting up an IV. She told me Kaylee needed fluids right away. I held Kaylee's arm steady while the paramedic inserted the needle. Kaylee whimpered but didn't pull away. The paramedic taped it down and hung the IV bag on a hook. She checked Kaylee's blood pressure and temperature. Everything was low. The paramedic wrote notes on a clipboard. The ride felt like it took forever but was probably only 10 minutes. When we got to the emergency room, they wheeled out a gurney. I laid Kaylee down on it but kept holding her hand. We went through automatic doors into a bright hallway. Nurses and doctors moved around us. Someone directed us to a room and I followed the gurney inside. They transferred Kaylee to a hospital bed and adjusted the IV. A doctor came in and introduced himself. I didn't catch his name. He started examining Kaylee while I stood next to the bed holding her hand. He checked her eyes and ears, listened to her heart and lungs, pressed on her stomach, asked her questions she didn't answer. He told a nurse to get labs drawn and keep the IV going. Then he turned to me and said they needed to do a complete exam to check for any other injuries. I stayed right next to Kaylee the whole time. A nurse came in to draw blood, and I watched the vials fill up, red and dark. Another nurse brought in a second IV bag. The doctor came back with a woman in regular clothes. She had a badge clipped to her belt. The doctor said this was a social worker from the hospital. The woman asked if she could speak to me privately. I didn't want to leave Kaylee, but the nurse said she'd stay with her. I followed the social worker into the hallway. She took me to a small office and closed the door. She explained that because this was a suspected child abuse case involving family members, they had to notify Child Protective Services. She said CPS would be opening an investigation and someone would be here soon to talk to me. I asked what that meant for Kaylee. The social worker said it meant they'd make sure Kaylee was safe and that whoever did this couldn't get near her again. I told her both women were already in police custody. She nodded and wrote something down. Then she asked me to describe what happened. I walked her through everything. The school calling, the search, finding Kaylee at Linda's house. The social worker took notes and said a detective would want to talk to me too. When I got back to Kaylee's room, a tall man in a suit was standing by her bed. He turned when I walked in and held out his hand. "I'm Detective Bertram Holcomb. I'm investigating your daughter's disappearance." I shook his hand. He asked if I could walk him through the timeline while Kaylee was getting treated. I started from the beginning. The school's phone call, getting stuck in traffic, Perry meeting me there at the exact same time, the cameras showing Kaylee walking toward the bathroom, 7 days of searching. The anonymous tip. Finding Kaylee tied up at Linda's house. Detective Holcomb wrote everything down in a small notebook. When I got to the part about calling the police from Linda's bedroom, he stopped me. He asked me to describe Perry and Linda's reactions when I pulled out my phone. I told him one of them went completely pale, like all the blood drained from her face. The other one smiled. Not a normal smile, a creepy one, like she thought something was funny. Detective Holcomb wrote that down very carefully. He underlined it twice. Then he asked which sister had which reaction. I stopped and tried to remember. It happened so fast. Perry and Linda were both standing there pointing at each other. I pulled out my phone. One face went white. The other smiled. But which was which? I closed my eyes and pictured it again. Perry was on the left. Linda on the right. I dialed 911. Perry's face went pale. Linda smiled. I opened my eyes and told Detective Holcomb. He wrote it down and circled something in his notes. He asked me to describe my relationship with Perry. I explained how she came into my life when Kaylee was 4, how she'd always been distant with Kaylee, made comments about wanting more couple time when Kaylee and I went on our daddy-daughter dates, but I never thought she'd do something like this. Never imagined she could hurt Kaylee. Detective Holcomb asked what I knew about Linda. I said not much. She was Perry's older sister. They weren't super close. Linda lived alone across town. I'd only met her maybe 5 times in all the years Perry and I were together. Detective Holcomb nodded and kept writing. He said he'd have more questions later but wanted to let me get back to Kaylee. A new woman walked into the room right after Detective Holcomb left. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and carried a folder. She introduced herself as Cecilia Holcomb. I asked if she was related to the detective. She said he was her husband. Small world. She explained she was a caseworker with Child Protective Services and they were opening an emergency investigation. She said the investigation would determine what safety measures needed to be in place to keep Kaylee protected. I asked what kind of measures. Cecilia said first and most important, Perry could not have any contact with Kaylee until the investigation was complete. No phone calls, no visits, no messages through other people, nothing. I needed to make sure Perry didn't come to our house or show up at Kaylee's school. Cecilia said they'd be filing for an emergency protective order through the courts. She also said I needed to change the locks on our house immediately. Perry still had keys. I hadn't even thought about that. Cecilia handed me a paper with instructions and phone numbers. She said someone from CPS would be checking in regularly, and I should call if I had any concerns about Kaylee's safety. The doctor came back in after Cecilia left. He had test results in his hand. He told me Kaylee was severely dehydrated and malnourished. She'd lost almost 8 pounds in 7 days. Her electrolytes were way off, but there were no signs of sexual assault. I started crying when he said that last part. Relief hit me so hard I almost fell over. The doctor put his hand on my shoulder. He said they wanted to keep Kaylee overnight for observation and continued IV fluids. Make sure her levels came back up. I nodded and wiped my eyes. The doctor said I could stay with her. There was a fold-out chair in the room. I thanked him, and he left. I pulled out my phone and called my boss. Explained I wouldn't be at work tomorrow. Probably not for a while. My daughter had been found after being missing for 7 days, and she was in the hospital. My boss told me to take all the time I needed. Don't worry about work. Just take care of my daughter. I hung up and sat down in the chair next to Kaylee's bed. She was finally sleeping. Her chest moved up and down with steady breaths. I held her hand and watched her sleep. That night I dozed off a few times, but mostly stayed awake watching Kaylee. Around 2 in the morning, she opened her eyes. The room was dark except for the glow from the monitors. I leaned forward and squeezed her hand. She looked at me, and her eyes filled with tears. Her voice came out tiny and broken. I thought you forgot me. Those words felt like a knife in my chest. I stood up and leaned over the bed rail. Told her I never stopped looking. Not for even 1 second. I searched everywhere. Called everyone. Put up flyers all over town. I never forgot her. Would never forget her. I promised I would always come for her no matter what. No matter where she was or how long it took. I would always find her. Always protect her. Always love her. Kaylee started crying harder, and I reached through the bed rail to wipe her tears. A nurse came in to check on us. She saw Kaylee was awake and asked if she needed anything. Kaylee shook her head. The nurse adjusted her IV and left. I stayed standing by the bed holding Kaylee's hand until she fell back asleep. The next morning, Detective Holcomb came back. He had more questions about Perry's behavior during the search. He wanted to know if I noticed anything strange. I thought back through those 7 days. Remembered how Perry got to the school at the exact same time as me, even though she was supposedly upstairs showering when I left the house. That never made sense. The traffic was terrible. It took me almost 30 minutes to get there. How did Perry get there at the same time if she had to call an Uber and wait for it to arrive? Detective Holcomb wrote that down. I also remembered how Perry seemed to switch between being panicked and weirdly calm. Like 1 minute she'd be crying, and the next she'd be making lists very calmly, organizing search parties, planning where to put flyers. It felt off at the time, but I thought she was just coping differently than me. Detective Holcomb asked if Perry ever suggested not searching certain areas. I thought about it. Yeah, she did. When volunteers wanted to search near Linda's neighborhood, Perry said it was too far away. Kaylee wouldn't have gone that far. We should focus closer to home. Detective Holcomb underlined something in his notebook. He said that was very helpful information. Detective Holcomb closed his notebook and left the room. About 20 minutes later, a woman in a gray suit knocked on the door and introduced herself as Cecilia from Child Protective Services. She pulled the fold-out chair closer to my side of the bed and sat down with a thick folder. She explained that CPS was opening a case to make sure Kaylee stayed safe. Perry was not allowed to have any contact with Kaylee at all. Not phone calls, not texts, not showing up at the house or school, nothing. I nodded and squeezed Kaylee's hand. Cecilia said I needed to change the locks on our house today before we went home. She couldn't let Kaylee go back to a house Perry could access. She pulled papers from her folder and handed them to me. A list of emergency therapy services for kids who went through trauma, support groups for parents, phone numbers for crisis hotlines. She also gave me a court date written on a yellow paper. A hearing for a temporary protective order in 3 days. I folded all the papers and put them in my pocket. Cecilia asked if I understood everything, and I said yes. She stood up and told me she'd be checking in regularly to make sure Kaylee was okay. The hospital discharged Kaylee that afternoon around 3. A nurse brought a wheelchair, but Kaylee didn't want to sit in it. She held my hand so tight my fingers went numb. We walked to my car in the parking lot. Kaylee wouldn't let go even when I needed to unlock the door. I had to use my left hand to get my keys out and open the passenger side. She climbed in and I buckled her seatbelt. Drove out of the parking lot and headed toward our house. About halfway home, Kaylee started crying. Not loud, just tears running down her face. I asked what was wrong. She said she didn't want to go inside because Perry might be there. My chest got tight. I told her Perry wasn't allowed to come home anymore. But Kaylee kept crying and said, what if Perry didn't listen? What if Perry was waiting inside? I pulled into our driveway and parked. Looked at our front door. Kaylee was right to be scared. I pulled out my phone and searched for locksmiths nearby. Found one that said same-day service. Called them. They said they could come in 40 minutes. I told them I'd pay extra if they came faster. They said 30 minutes. Kaylee and I sat in the car with the doors locked and waited. The locksmith showed up in a white van, an older guy with a tool belt. He asked what locks I needed changed, and I said all of them. Front door, back door, side door to the garage. He said it would take about an hour. I asked if we could wait in the backyard, and he said sure. Kaylee and I went around the side of the house to the back gate, sat on the patio chairs while the locksmith worked. I could hear him drilling inside. Kaylee leaned against me and closed her eyes. I pulled out my phone and opened my texts. Detective Holcomb had given me his number and told me to contact Perry through him if I needed to. I typed out a message. Told Perry she was not allowed to come home per CPS order. The locks were being changed. She needed to stay away from me and Kaylee. Sent it to Detective Holcomb, who said he'd forward it. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Detective Holcomb forwarded Perry's response. A long message. She said Linda forced her to help. She was scared of Linda. Linda threatened her. She's the real victim here. She just wanted to come home and explain everything. I stared at the message. Remembered Detective Holcomb telling me not to engage. I put my phone back in my pocket without replying. The locksmith finished and brought me the new keys. 3 sets. I paid him, and he left. Kaylee and I went inside through the back door. The house felt different. Empty. I locked the door behind us and tested the new key. It worked. Kaylee went straight to her bedroom. I followed her and stood in the doorway while she climbed into bed, even though it was only 4:30 in the afternoon. She pulled her stuffed bear close and closed her eyes. I sat on the floor next to her bed and just watched her breathe. That evening, my phone rang. Detective Holcomb. He said they'd been reviewing traffic camera footage and Uber records from the day Kaylee disappeared. I sat up straighter. He said Perry's Uber was called at 11:42 that morning, before I even left the house, before the school called me at 11:50. I felt my hands start shaking. Detective Holcomb said the traffic cameras showed Perry's car was already parked 2 blocks from the school when I called her. She was already there. She lied about being in the shower. She knew Kaylee was missing before anyone told her. I couldn't breathe right. Asked him what that meant. He said it meant Perry was likely involved in taking Kaylee from the school, not just helping Linda keep her afterward. She was part of it from the very beginning. My stomach hurt. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, leaned against the counter. Detective Holcomb said they were going back through the school's security footage more carefully, looking for any sign of Perry or Linda on campus that day, talking to staff about whether anyone saw them. He said he'd call me when he knew more. I hung up and just stood there, stared at the wall, tried to process what he'd told me. Perry planned this. Perry took Kaylee. Perry sat next to me for 7 days pretending to search while knowing exactly where Kaylee was. I thought I might throw up. 2 days later, Detective Holcomb called again. A neighbor who lived near Linda's house had contacted the police. She saw a sedan matching Perry's car parked in Linda's driveway multiple times during the week Kaylee was missing. The neighbor didn't think anything of it at the time because she knew Perry and Linda were sisters. But now she realized those visits were suspicious. Perry was checking on Kaylee, making sure Linda kept her tied up, making sure the plan was working. Detective Holcomb said this was good evidence, showed Perry's active participation. I thanked him and hung up. The next day, Detective Holcomb called with more news. They'd searched Linda's house more thoroughly, found zip ties and rope that matched what was used on Kaylee. They also found receipts. The items were purchased at a hardware store 2 days before Kaylee disappeared. Someone planned this in advance, bought supplies. Detective Holcomb said he was working on getting the store's security footage to see who made the purchase. I already knew it would be Perry. Kaylee had her first meeting with Cecilia from CPS a few days after we got home. Cecilia came to our house and sat with Kaylee in the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, but I could hear them talking. Cecilia asked gentle questions about what happened at Linda's house. Kaylee's voice was small. She said someone she trusted took her from the school, brought her to Linda's house, tied her up in the bedroom. She stayed there for all 7 days, only got crackers and water, mostly stayed alone in the dark. I heard Cecilia writing things down. She asked who took Kaylee from the school. Kaylee said Aunt Linda, but then she said she heard Perry's voice at least once, talking to Linda through the bedroom door. She couldn't hear what they were saying clearly, but she recognized Perry's voice, heard something about keeping her there until he learns his lesson. I grabbed the counter. My daughter heard Perry. Perry was there. Perry did this to teach me some kind of lesson about spending time with Kaylee. After Cecilia left, I called the attorney Montague Shaw that Cecilia had recommended. His secretary scheduled me for the next morning. I drove to his office downtown. Tall building with lots of windows. Montague met me in a conference room. Older guy with gray hair and a serious face. He asked me to explain what happened. I told him everything. About finding Kaylee. About Perry and Linda. About the evidence Detective Holcomb found. Montague listened and took notes. When I finished, he said I needed to file for separation from Perry right away. Get an emergency protective order. The criminal case against Perry and Linda was separate, but I needed to protect myself and Kaylee legally. Perry might try to claim parental rights, try to access our house, try to fight for custody. I needed legal protection in place before she tried anything. Montague said he'd start the paperwork today. I signed some forms and left his office feeling like everything was moving too fast and too slow at the same time. The next morning, Detective Holcomb called and asked me to come down to the station. He said the hardware store sent over their security footage and he wanted me to see it. I drove there alone because Kaylee was still at home with a neighbor watching her. Detective Holcomb met me at the front desk and walked me back to a small room with a computer screen. He sat me down and pulled up the video file. The footage was grainy but clear enough. I watched the timestamp show 3 days before Kaylee disappeared. Then I saw her. Perry walked into the frame wearing her blue jacket. She picked up zip ties from a shelf, then rope, then duct tape. My stomach dropped. Perry looked around like she was checking if anyone was watching. She went to the register and paid with cash. The cashier rang her up and Perry left. Detective Holcomb paused the video. He pointed at Perry's face on the screen. Her features were totally clear. No question it was her. Detective Holcomb said the timestamp and the items matched perfectly with what they found at Linda's house. Perry had planned this days in advance, bought the supplies herself, paid cash to try hiding it, but the camera caught everything. I sat there staring at the frozen image of my wife buying materials to kidnap my daughter. Detective Holcomb's phone rang while we were sitting there. He answered and listened for a minute. Then he told whoever was calling to send over the information. He hung up and looked at me. Linda's attorney had just contacted him. Linda wanted to make a deal. She was willing to cooperate with the investigation if they reduced her charges. Detective Holcomb said Linda was claiming Perry forced her to do everything. According to Linda, Perry threatened to report some old crime Linda committed 5 years ago. Check fraud or something. Linda said Perry told her that if she didn't help kidnap Kaylee and keep her hidden for a week, Perry would make sure Linda went to prison. I felt my hands clench into fists. Linda was trying to blame everything on Perry now that she got caught. Detective Holcomb must have seen my face because he held up his hand. He said both sisters were clearly guilty no matter who planned it. Linda still physically held Kaylee prisoner for 7 days. Linda still tied her up and left her in that dark room. The detective said they would investigate Linda's claims about the blackmail. But even if Perry did threaten Linda, that didn't excuse what Linda did. Kidnapping is kidnapping. I asked what happened next. Detective Holcomb said they were building the case against both of them. The evidence was strong. The next step was getting legal protection for me and Kaylee. I left the station and drove straight to Montague's office. I told him about the security footage and Linda's plea deal attempt. Montague said we needed to file for the emergency protective order right away. He had the paperwork ready. We filled it out together. Montague explained the order would legally bar Perry from contacting me or Kaylee. She couldn't come within 500 feet of our house or Kaylee's school. We had a court date the next day. The courthouse was busy when we arrived. Montague led me through security and up to a courtroom on the second floor. We sat at a table and waited. The judge came in and called our case. Montague stood up and explained the situation. He told the judge about Kaylee's kidnapping, about finding her tied up at Linda's house, about the security footage showing Perry buying the supplies, about the evidence that Perry planned the whole thing. The judge listened carefully and looked at the paperwork. Then he granted the temporary protective order immediately. Perry was now legally banned from coming near me or Kaylee. Just as the judge finished signing the order, the courtroom door opened. Perry's attorney walked in with Perry right behind him. They must have gotten notice about the hearing. Perry's attorney asked to speak. The judge let him. The attorney argued that Perry was innocent. He said Linda was framing Perry. He claimed all the evidence could be explained away, but the judge shook his head. He said the evidence was strong enough to warrant protection regardless. The protective order would stay in place. Perry sat in the gallery staring at me. Her face looked cold, empty, like she was a completely different person than the woman I married. I didn't recognize the expression at all. Montague touched my arm and we left the courtroom. 2 days later, Detective Holcomb called again. He was interviewing Kaylee that afternoon with a child specialist present. He wanted me to know, so I could prepare her. I told Kaylee that morning that a nice lady and Detective Holcomb wanted to talk to her about what happened. Kaylee got quiet, but she nodded. That afternoon, a woman arrived at our house with Detective Holcomb. She introduced herself as a forensic specialist who talks to kids. She had a gentle voice. They sat with Kaylee in the living room while I waited in the kitchen. I could hear them talking. The specialist asked Kaylee to describe what happened at Linda's house. Kaylee's voice was small. She said she heard voices through the bedroom door. One voice was Linda's, but she also heard Perry's voice at least once. Kaylee said Perry told Linda to make sure she stayed put and didn't make noise. Kaylee said Linda brought her crackers and water twice a day, but mostly Linda left her tied up alone in the dark bedroom. The specialist thanked Kaylee for being so brave. After they left, my phone rang. It was the school principal. He asked how Kaylee was doing and when she might come back to the school. I explained she was really shaken up and needed therapy first. The principal said he understood completely. He offered to set up a safety plan for when Kaylee was ready. Private doors for entering and leaving. A safe route that avoided the cafeteria and the hallway where she was taken. I thanked him and said I'd let him know when Kaylee was ready. The next morning, Cecilia from CPS came by for a home visit. She needed to check that our house was safe for Kaylee. I showed her the new locks I'd installed on all the doors. She walked through each room. In Kaylee's bedroom, she saw the baby monitor I'd set up on the dresser. I explained I wanted to hear if Kaylee had nightmares or needed me during the night. Cecilia nodded and wrote something on her clipboard. She said I was doing everything right. The security measures were good. A few days after that, Detective Holcomb called with more news. Perry's phone records had come back from the service provider. The records showed Perry did a factory reset on her phone on the second night of Kaylee's disappearance. She wiped everything, deleted all her messages and call history. Detective Holcomb said this showed consciousness of guilt. Perry knew she was doing something wrong. She tried to destroy evidence. This would help prove Perry planned everything and knew exactly what she was doing. Then Detective Holcomb told me something else. During the week Kaylee was missing, Perry had been posting all over social media, sharing the missing person flyers, asking people to pray, begging for information. Now it all seemed like a sick show. Perry was performing for everyone while she knew exactly where Kaylee was the whole time. Some of Perry's friends had been messaging me. Most of them said they couldn't believe Perry would do this. But a few were actually suggesting maybe I was lying. Maybe I made the whole thing up. Maybe Perry was innocent and I was trying to frame her. I showed Detective Holcomb the messages. He said to ignore them. The evidence spoke for itself. The next morning, Detective Holcomb called and asked me to come down to the station. He said Linda's attorney had provided some text messages that I needed to see. I left Kaylee with a neighbor and drove to the police station. Detective Holcomb met me in the same small room where we'd talked before. He slid his phone across the table, showing me screenshots of text messages between Perry and Linda from 2 weeks before Kaylee disappeared. The first message was from Perry. I need her gone for a while so he remembers who his real family is. Linda had responded asking what Perry meant by that. Perry wrote back immediately. Just do what I tell you and I'll make sure your fraud case stays buried. I read the messages 3 times. My hands started shaking. Detective Holcomb pulled his phone back and explained Linda's attorney was trying to get her a deal by proving Perry had planned everything and threatened Linda into helping. I asked if this meant Linda would get away with it. Detective Holcomb shook his head and said Linda still kidnapped my daughter and kept her tied up for a week, so she'd face prison time too, just maybe less than Perry. I drove home feeling sick. The messages proved Perry had planned to take Kaylee weeks in advance. She'd thought about it, prepared for it, and manipulated her own sister into doing it. That afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Rupert Cameron from the district attorney's office. He said he was the prosecutor assigned to build the criminal case against Perry and Linda. Rupert explained they were charging both sisters with kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and child endangerment. He said the evidence was strong, especially with Linda's cooperation and the text messages. Perry would likely face serious prison time, maybe 15 to 20 years. Linda would get less because she was cooperating, probably 3 to 5 years. Rupert asked if I had any questions. I asked when Perry would be arrested. He said soon, within the next few days. They were finishing the paperwork and coordinating with Detective Holcomb. After the call ended, I sat on the couch, staring at nothing. 3 days later, I took Kaylee to her first therapy appointment. The therapist's name was Phoebe Sterling, and her office was in a small building downtown. The waiting room had toys and books scattered around. Phoebe came out to meet us. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her 30s, with a calm voice. She shook my hand and then knelt down to Kaylee's level. Phoebe asked Kaylee if she wanted to come see her office. Kaylee grabbed my hand tight but nodded. We walked back together. Phoebe's office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs. She had a box of fidget toys on her desk. Phoebe explained to Kaylee that this was a safe space where she could talk about anything or nothing at all. Kaylee sat next to me on the small couch. Phoebe asked Kaylee how she was feeling today. Kaylee whispered that she was scared a lot. Phoebe nodded like this made perfect sense. She taught Kaylee some breathing exercises, showing her how to breathe in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts. Kaylee practiced a few times. Then Phoebe suggested they pick a safe word that Kaylee could use anytime she wanted to stop talking about something hard. Kaylee thought for a minute and said, pancakes, because that was her favorite breakfast. Phoebe smiled and wrote it down. The appointment lasted 45 minutes. On the drive home, Kaylee seemed a little lighter. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to screaming. I jumped out of bed and ran to Kaylee's room. She was sitting up in bed crying and pulling at invisible ropes on her wrists. I turned on the light and sat on her bed. Kaylee was still half asleep, screaming that she was tied up and couldn't get out. I held her and kept saying she was safe. She was home. The ropes were gone. It took several minutes for her to fully wake up. When she did, she looked around her bedroom and started crying harder. She said she didn't want to sleep in here anymore because it felt too dark. I carried her to the living room and turned on every single light. We made a nest of blankets on the couch. Kaylee curled up against me and I stayed awake the rest of the night watching her breathe. The next morning, Detective Holcomb called again. He said they'd searched Perry's car more thoroughly and found a notebook in the glove box. The notebook had a timeline written in Perry's handwriting. Kay leaves cafeteria 12 o'clock was written at the top. Below that it said L secures K by 12:30, and then wait 1 hour before calling police. Detective Holcomb said this proved Perry had planned every detail down to the specific times. She'd coordinated with Linda to grab Kaylee from the school and knew exactly when to call me acting surprised. I felt like I might throw up. Perry had written out her plan to kidnap my daughter like it was a grocery list. 2 days after that, Detective Holcomb called with more news. The clerk from the hardware store where Perry bought the rope and zip ties had come forward after seeing news coverage about the case. The clerk picked Perry out of a photo lineup without any hesitation. Detective Holcomb said the clerk remembered Perry seemed really nervous when buying the items and paid with cash. The clerk thought it was weird that someone would buy rope, zip ties, and duct tape all together, but didn't think much about it at the time. Now the clerk felt terrible for not saying something. This gave them another witness who could testify that Perry purchased the exact items used to restrain Kaylee. The following week, Rupert Cameron from the DA's office asked to meet with me in person. I drove to the courthouse and met him in a small conference room. Rupert was in his 50s with gray hair and a serious face. He spread out papers on the table showing me the evidence they'd collected. He explained the criminal process and what would happen next. Perry would be arrested soon and brought in for arraignment where she'd enter a plea. Then there would be pre-trial hearings and eventually a trial unless Perry accepted a plea deal. Rupert said I might need to testify about Perry's behavior and our relationship, especially how she resented the time I spent with Kaylee. He asked me to write down every comment Perry had made about wanting more couple time or seeming jealous of Kaylee. I started making the list right there. The next day, Detective Holcomb called to tell me Perry had been arrested. They'd found her staying at Linda's house. Perry was now in custody at the county jail. Detective Holcomb said Perry would be arraigned in 2 days. I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Perry couldn't get anywhere near Kaylee now. Sadness that the woman I'd married and trusted could do something so evil to an innocent child. I called Montague to tell him about the arrest. He said I should attend the arraignment so the judge could see that Kaylee had a protective parent present. 2 days later, I sat in the courtroom wearing the only suit I owned. Perry was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit with her hands cuffed. She looked straight ahead and didn't glance at me once. The judge read the charges out loud. Kidnapping, unlawful restraint, child endangerment, conspiracy. Perry's attorney stood up and entered a plea of not guilty. Then he argued that Perry should be released on bail because she had no prior criminal record and wasn't a flight risk. Rupert Cameron stood up and argued the opposite. He said Perry had planned and executed the kidnapping of a child, destroyed evidence by wiping her phone, and posed a clear danger to that child. He asked the judge to set bail high or deny it completely. The judge thought for a minute and then set bail at $500,000. Perry's attorney looked shocked. The judge said, given the serious nature of the charges and the evidence presented, high bail was appropriate. Perry was led back out. The next week, Linda had her arraignment. Montague had told me Linda was taking a plea deal to testify against Perry. I went to that hearing, too. Linda was brought in looking much smaller than I remembered. Her attorney stood with her as the judge read the reduced charges. Linda pleaded guilty to unlawful restraint and conspiracy. Her attorney had her read a statement she'd prepared. Linda's voice shook as she admitted she'd held Kaylee captive for 7 days under Perry's threats and direction. She said Perry had threatened to report Linda's old fraud case if Linda didn't help. Linda turned toward where I was sitting and apologized directly to me and Kaylee. She was crying. I sat there with my arms crossed. I didn't care about her tears. She still chose to tie up my daughter and leave her in a dark room for a week. The judge accepted the plea and set Linda's sentencing for 2 months later. Linda would likely get 3 years in prison. I sat there with my arms crossed, looking at Linda cry on the witness stand, and felt nothing but anger. She could have called the police the second Perry threatened her, but instead she chose to tie up my daughter and leave her in a dark room for 7 days. Her tears didn't change what she did to Kaylee. After the hearing ended, Rupert pulled me aside in the courthouse hallway and explained that Linda's cooperation was important for the case against Perry. He said Linda's testimony about Perry's threats and planning would help prove Perry was the one who came up with the whole kidnapping idea. Rupert told me Linda was getting 3 years in prison with a chance at parole if she behaved, but Perry was looking at 15 to 25 years if convicted at trial. The next day, I took Kaylee to her therapy appointment with Phoebe. We were going twice a week now, and Phoebe said Kaylee was showing clear signs of post-traumatic stress. Kaylee jumped at sudden noises and checked every room before going inside. She had nightmares almost every night and wouldn't let me out of her sight for more than a few minutes. Phoebe taught me some techniques to help Kaylee feel safer, like deep breathing exercises and creating a calm-down corner in her bedroom with soft blankets and stuffed animals. Phoebe also said we needed to set up very consistent routines so Kaylee would know exactly what to expect each day. Same wake-up time, same breakfast routine, same bedtime ritual every single night. The school counselor called me that afternoon to talk about Kaylee returning to the school. She said she'd been working with Phoebe to create a plan that would make Kaylee feel safe. They decided Kaylee would start with half days so she wouldn't get too tired or stressed. The school would assign a counselor as Kaylee's designated safe person, who she could go talk to anytime she felt scared or upset. They also arranged for Kaylee to use a private entrance near the office, so she wouldn't have to walk through the cafeteria or the back hallway where she'd been taken. 2 days later, Perry's parents called me. Her mom was crying, so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. They kept apologizing and saying they had no idea Perry was capable of doing something like this to Kaylee. They asked if they could see Kaylee and spend some time with her. I told them I needed to check with Cecilia from CPS first, because I wasn't sure if contact with Perry's family was safe for Kaylee right now. I called Cecilia that same afternoon and explained the situation. Cecilia said supervised visits with Perry's parents might be okay if Kaylee actually wanted to see them, and if they agreed to follow strict rules. They couldn't mention Perry at all, or ask Kaylee any questions about the kidnapping. Perry's parents agreed to those terms right away when I called them back. We set up a short visit at a park near our house for the following Saturday. When we got to the park, Perry's parents were already waiting at a picnic table with a container of Kaylee's favorite chocolate chip cookies. They hugged Kaylee gently and told her how much they missed her. They spent an hour just playing on the swings and feeding ducks at the pond. They kept their promise and never brought up Perry or what happened. The next week, Detective Holcomb called to tell me he was officially closing his investigation. He'd submitted the complete case file to Rupert's office with everything they'd collected. The file included security footage from the school and hardware store, phone records showing all of Perry's calls, and texts, the messages between Perry and Linda about the kidnapping plan, financial records of Perry's cash withdrawals, witness statements from the neighbor and store clerk, Linda's full confession, and Kaylee's testimony about hearing Perry's voice. Rupert told me later that week it was one of the strongest cases he'd ever seen. I met with Montague to start the divorce process. He helped me file papers asking for separation from Perry based on our marriage being broken beyond repair. I was requesting full custody of Kaylee with absolutely no visitation rights for Perry. Montague said, given the criminal charges against Perry, no judge in their right mind would give her any access to Kaylee. He expected the divorce to go through without any problems. A few days later, Perry's attorney contacted Montague trying to work out some kind of arrangement where Perry could at least talk to Kaylee on the phone or send letters. I told Montague absolutely not, and he informed Perry's attorney that any contact would break the protective order. Montague threatened to report them for trying to pressure us, and Perry's attorney backed off immediately. 3 weeks after Linda's sentencing, Kaylee was ready to try going back to the school. I walked her inside using the private entrance near the main office. Her teacher was waiting for us and gave Kaylee a special job as line leader for the class. The teacher said this would help Kaylee feel important and give her something positive to focus on. The school counselor checked on Kaylee twice during the morning to make sure she felt comfortable and safe. I picked Kaylee up at lunchtime and she seemed tired but okay. We did half days like this for the entire week. Kaylee came home exhausted each day, but she was proud of herself for going. On Friday afternoon, after I picked her up, Kaylee told me she wanted to try staying for full days starting Monday. She said she missed her friends and felt sad about leaving early when everyone else got to stay. I called Phoebe that evening to ask if this was too fast. Phoebe said it was actually a positive sign that Kaylee wanted to rebuild her normal routine, and that meant she was starting to feel safe again. We agreed to move to full days, but the counselor would keep checking on Kaylee regularly to make sure she wasn't struggling. 2 weeks after Kaylee started full days at the school, my phone rang while I was making dinner. Rupert Cameron's name showed on the screen. I picked up and he got straight to it. Perry rejected the plea deal. She wanted a trial. She was claiming she had nothing to do with the kidnapping and Linda acted alone out of jealousy. Rupert said this meant the case would go to court, and I would need to testify about Perry's behavior toward Kaylee over the years. The comments about wanting more couple time, the coldness toward my daughter, the weird behavior during the search, and Kaylee might need to testify too. My stomach dropped at that. Rupert said he would only call Kaylee if absolutely necessary, but her testimony about hearing Perry's voice through the door was important evidence. He promised to make it as easy as possible for her if it came to that. I hung up and called Phoebe right away. She said we should start preparing Kaylee just in case, using play therapy to make the idea of testifying less scary. The next week, Phoebe brought out stuffed animals during their session and set up a pretend courtroom. Kaylee practiced telling her story to a stuffed bear wearing a judge's robe that Phoebe made from black fabric. Phoebe explained that Kaylee could ask for breaks anytime she felt tired or upset. They practiced what questions might be asked and how Kaylee could answer in her own words without feeling pressured. Kaylee seemed nervous, but she liked the stuffed animal judge and asked if she could bring her own teddy bear to the real court. Phoebe said absolutely yes. Over the next few weeks, they did more practice sessions. Kaylee got better at telling what happened without getting too upset. Phoebe taught her breathing exercises to use if she started feeling overwhelmed. By the end of the month, Kaylee seemed as ready as she could be for something no kid should ever have to do. 3 months after we found Kaylee at Linda's house, the trial started. I took time off work and told my boss I needed to be there every single day. The courthouse was downtown in a big old building with marble floors and high ceilings. Rupert met me outside the courtroom on the first morning and walked me through what would happen. He said he would present the evidence step by step, starting with the school reporting Kaylee missing and building through the investigation to Perry's arrest. The jury was 12 people who looked like regular folks from around town. Perry sat at the defense table in a navy blue suit, looking calm and put together. Her attorney was a guy in an expensive suit who kept shuffling papers. Rupert stood up and gave his opening statement, laying out the timeline of Kaylee's disappearance and explaining how the evidence would prove Perry planned and carried out the kidnapping with Linda's help. He spoke clearly and made eye contact with the jurors. Perry's attorney argued that Linda acted alone and Perry was innocent. The first witnesses were school staff who testified about Kaylee going missing from the cafeteria. Then the principal described how we searched the building and called the police. Each witness added another piece to the timeline Rupert was building. On day 2, Linda took the stand. She looked smaller than I remembered, wearing an orange jumpsuit because she was already in custody serving her sentence. Rupert asked her to describe what happened, and Linda's voice shook as she talked. She said Perry called her 3 weeks before Kaylee disappeared and asked if Linda would help with something important. Perry came to Linda's house and explained the plan. Perry wanted Kaylee taken from the school and kept at Linda's house for a week to teach me a lesson about prioritizing my wife over my daughter. Linda said she told Perry it was crazy, but Perry threatened to report Linda's old fraud case from 5 years ago. Linda had written bad checks and never got caught, but Perry knew about it and said she would turn Linda in if Linda didn't help. Linda admitted she went along with it because she was scared of going to jail. She drove to Kaylee's school on the day it happened, walked in through a side entrance Perry had told her about, and found Kaylee in the hallway near the bathroom. Linda told Kaylee there was an emergency and she needed to come right away. Kaylee trusted her aunt and went without asking questions. Linda brought her to the house and tied her up in the bedroom like Perry instructed. Linda said Perry came by twice during the week to check that everything was going according to plan. Linda's voice broke when she said she knew she should have called the police instead of hurting an innocent child. Perry's attorney tried to make Linda look like a liar during cross-examination, but Linda stuck to her story. The next day, Detective Holcomb testified. He described the investigation in detail, walking the jury through each piece of evidence he collected. Rupert showed the hardware store security footage on a big screen at the front of the courtroom. The video was grainy, but you could clearly see Perry's face as she picked up rope, zip ties, and duct tape from the shelves. The timestamp showed it was 3 days before Kaylee disappeared. Several jurors leaned forward to look closer at the screen, and a few of them glanced at Perry with disgusted expressions. Detective Holcomb explained how Perry paid with cash, probably thinking it would hide the purchase, but the store's cameras caught everything. Then Rupert presented Perry's phone records, showing all the calls between Perry and Linda in the weeks before the kidnapping. Detective Holcomb testified that Perry Factory reset her phone on day 2 of Kaylee's disappearance, clearly trying to destroy evidence. The detective showed the jury the notebook found in Perry's car, with the timeline written in her handwriting. The entries included specific times like K leaves cafeteria 12 o'clock, and L secures K by 12:30, and wait 1 hour before calling police. Detective Holcomb said this proved Perry planned every detail and coordinated with Linda to execute it. Perry's attorney asked if someone else could have written in the notebook, but a handwriting expert had already confirmed it was Perry's writing. The detective also testified about the neighbor who saw Perry's car at Linda's house multiple times during the week Kaylee was missing. On day 4, I took the stand. Rupert asked me to describe my relationship with Kaylee and Perry. I explained how Kaylee had been a happy, loving kid since birth, and how Perry came into our lives when Kaylee was 4. I told the jury about Perry's comments over the years about wishing we had more couple time without Kaylee around, how Perry seemed bothered by our daddy-daughter dates, and made little remarks about feeling left out. Rupert asked about Perry's behavior during the search, and I described the weird things I noticed. How Perry arrived at the school at the exact same time as me, even though she was supposedly showering when I left the house. How her Uber was called before I even got the call from the school. How Perry seemed to switch between genuine panic and this cold, calculating look during the week we searched. I told the jury about Perry talking about closed casket funerals on day 6 when we still had no leads. How she posted on social media asking for prayers while knowing exactly where Kaylee was the whole time. Perry's attorney tried to suggest I was making things up because I was angry about the divorce, but I stuck to what I saw. The facts spoke for themselves. The hardest day was when Kaylee testified. Rupert set up a closed-circuit video system so Kaylee could testify from another room without having to see Perry in person. Kaylee's face appeared on the screen at the front of the courtroom. She was holding her teddy bear, and Phoebe sat next to her just out of frame. Rupert asked gentle questions, and Kaylee answered in a clear voice that was braver than any 7-year-old should have to be. She described being in the cafeteria at lunch and then walking toward the bathroom. She said Aunt Linda found her in the hallway and told her there was an emergency. Kaylee trusted Linda and got in the car. Linda drove her to the house and brought her upstairs to the bedroom. Kaylee said Linda tied her wrists with rope and put a gag in her mouth. The room was dark most of the time, and Kaylee was scared. She heard voices through the door sometimes. One time, she clearly heard Perry's voice talking to Linda. Perry said something about keeping her there until he learns his lesson. Kaylee said she knew it was Perry because she recognized the voice after living with Perry for 3 years. She heard Perry visit at least one other time, but couldn't make out the words. Kaylee described the 7 days tied up with minimal food and water, not knowing if anyone was looking for her. Several jurors wiped their eyes during Kaylee's testimony. Even Perry's attorney didn't cross-examine her harshly because it would have looked terrible to attack a traumatized child on the stand. Perry took the stand on day 6 to defend herself. She wore a different suit and had her hair pulled back neatly. She claimed Linda acted completely alone out of jealousy over Perry's marriage to me. Perry said Linda had always been jealous of Perry's life and wanted to hurt the family. Perry testified she had no knowledge of the kidnapping until we found Kaylee at Linda's house. She said Linda must have forged the timeline in the notebook and Perry's signature. Rupert stood up for cross-examination and pulled out the text messages between Perry and Linda from 2 weeks before the kidnapping. He read them out loud to the jury. Perry writing, "I need her gone for a while so he remembers who his real family is." Linda asking what Perry meant. Perry responding, Just do what I tell you and I'll make sure your fraud case stays buried. Perry's face went pale as Rupert read each message. She claimed the messages were taken out of context, but couldn't explain what other context would make sense. Rupert showed the hardware store footage again and asked Perry to explain why she bought rope and zip ties 3 days before Kaylee disappeared. Perry said she was doing home repairs but couldn't provide any receipts or evidence of repairs. Rupert presented the notebook with the timeline and asked Perry to explain how someone else could have written in her handwriting with her pen in her car. Perry stumbled through answers that didn't make sense. The jury looked skeptical. Perry's testimony fell apart piece by piece as Rupert methodically showed her each piece of evidence and watched her fail to explain it convincingly. The jury got the case on day 7 after closing arguments from both sides. They went into the deliberation room at 10 in the morning. Rupert told me it could take anywhere from hours to days for them to reach a verdict. I sat in the hallway with Montague and waited. At 2 in the afternoon, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. 4 hours of deliberation. Rupert said that was fast, and usually meant the evidence was overwhelming. We filed back into the courtroom and I sat in the front row. The jury filed in looking serious. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict and the foreman stood up. Guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, conspiracy, unlawful restraint, child endangerment. The foreman read each verdict clearly, and the judge thanked the jury for their service. Perry sat completely still at the defense table, showing no emotion at all. Her face was blank like she was made of stone. I saw her attorney put his head in his hands and shake his head slowly. The judge set a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, and Perry was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness wash over me as I watched her go. 2 weeks later, we came back for sentencing. The judge asked if anyone wanted to make impact statements before he decided Perry's sentence. I stood up and walked to the podium. I told the judge about the trauma Kaylee suffered and how she still had nightmares and separation anxiety. How she was scared to go to the school and didn't trust people the way she used to. How Perry's actions stole Kaylee's innocence and sense of safety in the world. Phoebe also gave a statement as Kaylee's therapist, describing the post-traumatic stress and the long road of recovery ahead. She said Kaylee would need years of therapy to process what happened, and might never fully get over the betrayal by someone who was supposed to be family. The judge listened carefully and took notes. Then he looked at Perry and spoke in a firm voice. He said her actions represented a profound betrayal of the most basic duty of a parent to protect children. He said the planning and manipulation showed a level of cruelty that demanded serious consequences. The judge sentenced Perry to 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Perry would be in her 50s before she could even apply for parole. The courtroom was silent as the judge finished speaking. Perry was led away and I walked out into the hallway where Montague was waiting. He told me the divorce would be finalized quickly now, and I would have sole custody with Perry having zero rights to contact or visitation. It was over. The legal part anyway. The healing would take much longer. Montague walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. He told me the divorce paperwork would be finalized within 2 weeks since Perry was now convicted. I would have sole custody with zero visitation rights for Perry. She couldn't contact Kaylee or me in any way. I nodded and felt this weird mix of emotions. Relief that she couldn't hurt us anymore. Sadness that Kaylee lost someone who was supposed to be family. Montague said he'd email me the final documents once the judge signed them. We shook hands and I drove home alone. 3 days later, Cecilia from CPS called and asked to meet at her office. I brought Kaylee with me, and we sat in the waiting room with the plastic chairs and kids' toys. Cecilia came out and smiled at both of us. She led us into her office and pulled out a file. She told me she was officially closing our case. Perry was in prison, and Linda was also locked up. There was no ongoing threat to Kaylee's safety. Cecilia looked at me directly and said I'd done an excellent job protecting Kaylee. I'd gotten her therapy, kept her safe, navigated the legal system. She was confident Kaylee would continue healing. I felt my throat get tight. Cecilia shook my hand and gave Kaylee a small stuffed bear as a goodbye gift. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Kaylee's nightmares were getting less frequent. Instead of every single night, she only woke up screaming once or twice a week. Phoebe told me this was normal progress for trauma recovery. Kaylee still slept with a nightlight on and sometimes came to my room at 3 in the morning, but she was learning to self-soothe. She'd use the breathing exercises Phoebe taught her. She'd hold her stuffed bear and count to 10. Some nights she could calm herself down and go back to sleep without me. I talked to my boss about returning to work full-time. He'd been incredibly understanding through everything. He set up a flexible schedule that let me take Kaylee to therapy twice a week. I could leave early for school events or doctor appointments. My coworkers were supportive without being nosy. They didn't ask for details about what happened. They just told me they were glad Kaylee was safe. I settled back into my routine of emails and meetings and project deadlines. It felt good to have normal work stress instead of the nightmare we'd been living. 6 months after finding Kaylee in that bedroom, I decided we needed a fresh start. I found a smaller house in a different neighborhood across town. New schools, new neighbors, new everything. Kaylee came with me to look at houses and got excited about picking one. When we found the right place, I let her choose the paint color for her bedroom. She picked bright, cheerful yellow. We bought glow-in-the-dark stars to stick on the ceiling. Kaylee told me she wanted them because even dark rooms can have light. That made me tear up, but I didn't let her see. The new school had an opening on their soccer team, and Phoebe thought it would be wonderful for Kaylee. Sports would build her confidence and give her normalcy. I signed her up and bought her cleats and shin guards. I went to every single practice and every game. I sat in the bleachers and watched her run around with other kids. She laughed when she scored goals. She high-fived her teammates. Seeing her act like a regular kid again made me believe she really would be okay. Not today or tomorrow, but eventually. We built new routines in our new house. Friday nights became movie nights where we'd make popcorn and watch whatever Kaylee wanted. Saturday mornings I'd make pancakes and we'd eat breakfast together at our small kitchen table. Just the two of us building our own little family. Kaylee still had hard days where the trauma came back. She'd get quiet and scared, but she learned to tell me when she was struggling. We'd work through it together with the tools Phoebe taught us. One evening about 8 months after everything happened, we were making dinner together. Kaylee was stirring pasta sauce while I chopped vegetables. She looked up at me with those big eyes and said she felt safe now. She knew I would always protect her no matter what. I put down the knife and hugged her tight. I promised her that was exactly right. I told her I was so proud of how brave and strong she'd been. We weren't perfect, and we were still healing, but we had each other and that was enough.